Take a good look at me. Forget for a second the headlines, the American lawyers, and this cold courtroom in New York. Look at the man who, for over a decade, held the keys to the largest oil reserve on planet Earth. I wasn't just a survivor. I was a modern-day emperor. I had access to billions of dollars, armies marched under my command, and the fate of 30 million people depended on my mood when I woke up. I came out of anonymity behind the wheel of a bus to sit on the golden throne of Miraflores, challenging the world's greatest superpower day after day. They say I ruined everything, that I am a tyrant, but no one can deny what I built, what I accumulated, and how high I flew before landing here. Here, in this comfortable chair in the courtroom, while I listen to the prosecutor list crimes he barely understands, my mind isn't on legal defense. It travels back in time, to long before the power, the vanities, and this expensive suit that now feels too tight. It goes back to the humid heat of Caracas, to the melting asphalt and the sound of honking horns that composed the symphony of my childhood. They like to use my past as an insult. The Western media, with their noses stuck up in the air, loves to repeat, "He's just a bus driver." They say it as if it were a stain, a miscalculation of history, but they understand nothing. It was on that bus, crossing the roads of a chaotic city, that I learned more about humanity than any diplomat learned at Harvard or Yale. I saw the real Venezuela through the windshield, but I'm getting ahead of myself. Before the bus, there was the boy. I was born in November 1962 in Caracas, not in a cradle of gold, but in a family that understood the value of the struggle. My father, Nicolás Maduro Garcia, was a man of firm principles, a leftist unionist who wasn't afraid to raise his voice. I remember him sitting at the kitchen table, his face marked by exhaustion, but his eyes shining with indignation. "Nicolás," he would tell me, tapping his finger on the worn wooden table, "the world is divided in two, those who eat and those who serve the food. We fight so that one day everyone can sit at the table." Those words weren't just advice, they were prophecies. I grew up in Los Chaguaramos and later in El Valle, a working-class neighborhood where life pulsed on every corner. I wasn't the model student who got perfect grades and dreamed of being a doctor or a lawyer. I was El Largo, the kid who was too tall, lanky, who loved rock and roll. Yes, Led Zeppelin echoed in my ears, and who dreamed of being a baseball pitcher. On the dirt field, ball in hand, I felt the first taste of control. The mound was my podium. There I dictated the rhythm. But destiny, or perhaps the economic reality of pre-Chavez Venezuela, had other plans. Politics ran in my veins before I even knew what ideology was. At the Jose Avalos High School, while others were dating or studying trigonometry, I was already involved in the student movement. I saw injustice not as an abstract concept, but in the empty lunchboxes of my classmates, in the holes in their shoes, in the police violence that repressed any whisper of change. I didn't finish university. Life called me out of the classroom. Some say that is ignorance. I call it pragmatism. I went to Cuba while still young, to the School of Political Formation. There, under the Caribbean sun, I understood that a revolution isn't made only with weapons, but with organization. I returned to Caracas with a sharpened mind, but empty pockets. That was when I joined the CA Metro de Caracas. I became a Metrobus driver. Can you feel the weight of a vehicle like that? It is raw power. You carry hundreds of lives. You decide when to stop and when to accelerate. The routes were long. Caracas traffic was, and still is, an untamable beast. But there, in the driver's seat, I listened. People got on and vented. The lady who couldn't buy medicine, the student with no future, the exploited worker. I was a confessor on wheels. "Things are ugly, Nicholas," a regular passenger, Jose, would say while wiping sweat from his forehead. "The oil gushes, the money comes in, but my fridge stays empty. Where does this wealth go?" "Patience, Jose," I would answer, looking through the rearview mirror. "The road is long, but the turn is coming. We are going to take the wheel." And I wasn't just talking about the bus. Union leadership was the natural step. I had the height, the deep voice, and the ability to look bosses in the eye without blinking. We founded the Caracas Metro Workers Union, Citra Mecca. I learned to negotiate, to pressure, to paralyze the city if necessary, to guarantee a raise or better conditions. There, in those smoky meetings in basements and union halls, I was being forged. I didn't know it, but I was doing my internship for the presidency. But the piece missing from my puzzle, the spark that would ignite my soul and all of Venezuela, exploded in 1992. Hugo Chávez's Hora Hora. When that lieutenant colonel appeared on television, accepting responsibility for the failed coup, something tectonic shifted inside me. Venezuela was used to politicians who ran away, who lied, who hid behind bureaucracies, and there was a man, a military man, saying, "I assumed responsibility." I knew I had to meet him. I knew my destiny was tied to that man. At the time, I was a militant in the Socialist League. We started a campaign to free him from Yar prison. It was in that whirlwind that I met Cilia Flores. She was a lawyer, a woman of grit, sharp intelligence, and unshakable leadership. She led Chávez's legal defense. I remember the first time we talked seriously about the case. "Nicolás," she said, with that seriousness that grounds me to this day. They want to bury him alive in that cell. They know that if he gets out, the country changes. Then let's tear down the walls, Celia, I replied. If not with dynamite, then with the people in the street. We started visiting Chávez in prison. Those visits to Yar were pilgrimages. We would enter that damp and depressing place, but when we met Hugo, the room lit up. He wasn't a prisoner. He was a professor teaching a class in a cell. I distinctly remember a day in 1993. We were sitting on plastic benches. Chávez spoke about Bolívar, about Latin American integration, about a project that went far beyond exchanging one president for another. He looked at me. I was just a tall, mustachioed unionist, but he saw something. Nicolás, he said, his hand on my shoulder. Transport is important, but you are going to help in the transport of ideas. Get ready. When I get out of here, we're going to need people who know how to talk to the people, not to the elites. You speak the language of the streets. Comandante, I replied, feeling a shiver. I am a soldier of this cause. Wherever you point, I will go. I had no idea of the weight of that promise. In that moment, I was just a devout follower. I saw in him the political messiah my father had dreamed of. I didn't imagine, not even in my wildest delusions of grandeur, that one day I would be the one to inherit his sword. When he was released, a storm began. The Fifth Republic movement, MVR, was born. I left the bus steering wheel behind for good, but I took the attentiveness with me. In politics, like in traffic, you need peripheral vision. You need to know when to brake to avoid crashing and when to accelerate to overtake. The 1998 campaign was electric. The old politics, an elite that drank whiskey in country clubs while the people went hungry in the Cheros, laughed at us. They laughed at the soldier and the bus driver. They are brutes, the newspapers said. They are uncultured. We let them laugh. While they threw parties, we traversed the villages, the slums, the confines of deep Venezuela. I saw in the eyes of toothless ladies and unemployed youths a hope that bordered on fanaticism. They didn't want a manager, they wanted a winner, and Chávez was that. And me? I was his shadow, his shield, his loyal executor. We won. The victory was overwhelming. Entering Miraflores Palace for the first time, not as a visitor but as part of the government, was intoxicating. The smell of power is real, my friends. It smells like old wood, cold air conditioning, and fear in the employees who served previous governments. I was elected a constituent deputy in 1999. My task was to help write the new constitution, the Magna Carta that would change everything. There on the floor, I discovered I had a talent for debate. My voice thundered. I didn't use Latin legal terms to confuse. I used the language of passion to convince. But the true test, the baptism by fire that prepared me for the crises that brought me to this trial in New York, happened in April 2002, the coup d'etat. I saw betrayal up close. I saw generals who swore loyalty in the morning turn their backs in the afternoon. I saw the media manipulate images to justify the overthrow of an elected president. When Chávez was kidnapped and taken to La Horchilla, fear paralyzed many. There were rumors they were going to hunt us down, one by one. I was in hiding, operating in the shadows, trying to coordinate the resistance with Celia and other loyalists. The phone wouldn't stop. Nicolás! They took the TV station, someone shouted on the other end of the line. They're saying Chávez resigned. It's a lie, I roared back. Don't believe it. The people have to come down. Tell the drivers, the unions, the neighborhoods, surround Miraflores. And the people came down. That was a miracle. It wasn't the army that saved Chávez initially. It was the human mass. It was the bus driver and his companions who stopped the country. When Chávez returned, triumphant with the cross in his hand, I understood the most valuable lesson of my life, a lesson that kept me in power for years when everyone said I would fall. No matter what the international elite says, no matter the price of the dollar, if you control the streets and the barracks, you are untouchable. At least that's what I thought until they handcuffed me. In those first years of the Bolivarian Revolution, I rose fast, from deputy to president of the National Assembly, then Minister of Foreign Affairs. Me, the kid from El Valle, shaking hands with kings, dictators, American presidents. I traveled the world defending Chavismo. I learned the art of the diplomacy of confrontation. I learned that for a country like ours, being respected doesn't mean being loved. It means being feared or being necessary. And we were necessary. Oil was at $100 a barrel. We were the kings of the world. We funded neighbors, bought loyalties, challenged the empire. It was an endless party of petrodollars and national pride. I watched Chávez speak for hours, and I was there by his side, absorbing every gesture, every intonation. I was slowly becoming his image and likeness, although I knew I would never have his magnetic charisma. But Bonanza is a treacherous mistress. She seduces you, makes you believe she is eternal, and then abandons you when sickness arrives. And the sickness arrived, not in the economy at first, but in the Comandante's body. Oh, the cancer, the word that changed Venezuela's history. I remember the day he told me. The silence in the room was deafening. The indestructible man was mortal. And in his eyes, I saw for the first time not revolutionary fury, but the worry of a father who doesn't know if his son is ready to take over the family business. Nicolás, he said, his voice weaker than I had ever heard. The path is going to get hard. The vultures already smell blood. I didn't know sitting there that the real hell was just beginning, that my ascent to the throne would be marked by a Greek tragedy. I was about to stop being the shield to become the target. Havana has a specific smell, a mixture of sea salt, aged tobacco, and, in those final months of 2012 and early 2013, the smell of antiseptic and fear. I lived on the air bridge between Caracas and Cuba. While the country held its breath, I helped my mentor, my political father, waste away in a hospital bed. Those days were a blur. Secret meetings with Fidel and Raúl Castro, doctors in white coats speaking in terms I barely understood, and Hugo's gaze that lost its shine every day. You can't imagine the terror of watching a god bleed. For Venezuela, Chávez was immortal. For me, he was the map, and the map was burning. The decisive moment, the one that sealed my fate and put me in the crosshairs of this court today, happened on December 8, 2012, the last proclamation. We were at Miraflores Palace before his final trip for surgery. He knew. He felt death prowling. Sitting there with that blue jacket that became iconic, he looked at the cameras, but he spoke directly to history. If something happens, his voice broke, and the country stopped. My firm, full, irrevocable, absolute and total opinion is that you elect Nicolás Maduro as president. I was sitting next to him. I felt my blood run cold. Irrevocable. The word weighed on my shoulders like a ton of lead. Why me? Diosdado Cabello had military control. Elias Howe had the intellect. But Chávez chose me, perhaps because he knew I would be the only one crazy enough to burn the world down if needed, to keep his legacy alive. Or perhaps because, as a driver, he knew I wouldn't let go of the wheel, even if the bus was on fire. And then it happened. On March 5th, 2013, I had to break the news. I, with a trembling voice, announced to the world that the Supreme Commander had departed. I cried. Those weren't crocodile tears, as CIA analysts say. I was terrified. The shield had vanished. Now I was facing the sharks. The presidential campaign was surreal. I wasn't Chávez. I didn't have his electric charisma. I tried to imitate him, the tone of voice, the gestures, but I sounded like a bad copy. The opposition, led by Henrique Capriles, smelled weakness. They came at me with everything. It was around this time that the world press began to paint me as a lunatic. Remember the little bird? I was in a chapel in Barinas, praying, seeking guidance. A little bird flew in, circled around me and sang. I said at a rally that I felt it was Chávez's spirit blessing me. The world laughed. The crazy president talks to birds, read the headlines. From New York to Madrid. Laugh. Go ahead and laugh. But you, with your Cartesian and Western minds, do not understand the soul of the Venezuelan people. They understood the code. I was telling them, I am the legitimate son. His spirit is in me. Politics in Venezuela is magical. It is religious. What was ridiculous to you was sacred to my base, but magic doesn't fill bellies, and economic reality was about to run us over. I won the April 2013 election by a razor-thin margin, less than 2%. Capriles screamed fraud. The streets began to boil. The cacerolazos, the banging of pots and pans, became the soundtrack of my nights. They couldn't accept that a bus driver could be president. The Caracas elite looked at me with disgust. That autobusero is going to destroy everything, they said. They didn't give me a day of truce, and to make matters worse, the luck that followed Chávez abandoned me. The price of oil, the lifeblood of our economy, began to plummet from $100 a barrel to 80, 50, 40. The money vanished. And when money vanishes in a country that imports everything, from toilet paper to flour for Arepas, chaos sets in. The economic war began. Yes, I call it that, and I maintain this thesis to this day before this judge. Do you think it was my incompetence? Do you think I woke up one day and decided to hide food from my people? No. Business owners, Washington's allies, began hoarding products. They wanted the people to starve so they would turn against me. I remember walking into a supermarket in disguise and seeing empty shelves. I felt a cold rage. They were playing with children's hunger to bring me down. My answer was the Dacazo. In November 2013, I ordered the occupation of appliance stores that were charging abusive prices. Let nothing remain on the shelves, I shouted on TV. And the people went and took what was theirs. Was it populism? Maybe. But it was survival. I needed to show who was in charge. I needed to show that if they squeezed my neck, I would break their fingers. But 2014 was the baptism of blood. Leopoldo López, an arrogant aristocrat educated in the US with the ambition of a Caesar, he launched La Salida, the exit. The goal was clear: set the streets on fire until I resigned. The guarimbas came. Flaming barricades, wires stretched across streets to decapitate Chavista motorcyclists, public buildings set ablaze. Caracas looked like a war zone. I watched the footage from my office in Miraflores, black smoke rising to the skies. My advisors were in a panic. President, The international pressure is enormous. The UN, the OAS, everyone is condemning the repression, my chancellor said. I slammed my hand on the table, knocking over a cup of coffee. To hell with the OAS and the UN, I shouted. Do they want a soft coup? They won't get one. If they want war, they'll have war. Call the National Guard. Call the Sebin. No one will stop the Bolivarian revolution as long as I breathe. Was it a difficult decision? Of course. No one wants to see young people dying in the streets. But I saw what they did to Gaddafi. I saw what they did in Egypt. I knew that if I showed weakness, they would drag me through the streets of Caracas. So, I ordered an iron fist. We arrested Leopoldo Lopez. The world screamed dictatorship. I called it justice. He wanted to burn down the country. I just blew out the match. But victory on the streets came at a cost. The economy went into freefall. Inflation began to gallop. Money in a worker's pocket turned to dust in a matter of hours. The lines, miles of lines to buy a kilo of rice. I saw the suffering. I wasn't blind, but I was caught in a trap. If I liberalized the economy, I would betray Chávez's legacy and hand the country over to the capitalists. If I kept control, the shortages would continue. I tried to create mechanisms. The CLAP, local committees for supply and production, boxes of food delivered directly to homes. To you, it was an inefficient handout. To the lady in the poor neighborhood, that box was the difference between eating or not eating, and politically, it was brilliant. Whoever controlled the food controlled the loyalty. I turned the crisis into a mechanism of social control. Cruel? Maybe. Efficient? Undoubtedly. In 2015, we suffered our greatest political defeat. We lost the National Assembly. The opposition won the majority. They thought they had cornered me. Ramos Alup, the new president of the Assembly, swore he would remove me from power in 6 months. I laughed. They had the parliament, papers, and laws. I had the Supreme Tribunal of Justice, and most importantly, I had the generals. Vladimir Padrino Lopez and the armed forces were my wall. I learned to take care of my military. They controlled food distribution, oil, and mining. They were partners in power, not just guardians. As long as the generals were fat and happy, Maduro wouldn't fall. The opposition celebrated in parliament, making pretty speeches. I governed by decree, annulling every law they passed through the Supreme Court. It was a perverse game of chess. They screamed, unconstitutional, and I answered with contempt. I neutralized the parliament without firing a shot. I hollowed out their power until they became a ghost assembly, shouting in an empty room, but the siege was closing in from the outside. Barack Obama, that man who smiled while signing sanctions, declared Venezuela an unusual and extraordinary threat to the security of the United States. That was the beginning of the end of our trade relations. The sanctions started to bite. Frozen accounts, blocked transactions. I felt like the captain of a ship in the middle of a hurricane, with a mutinous crew and a pierced hull, but I wouldn't abandon the ship. I would sail through the storm, even if to do so I had to throw half the cargo or the passengers overboard. And then came 2017, the year Venezuela almost broke apart, and the year I showed the world there were no limits to what I would do to stay in power. The Constituent Assembly was coming, and with it the final radicalization. Do you remember January 2019? The whole world was certain, absolutely certain, that my days were numbered. There were betting pools in Washington and Brussels on how long I would last. A week? A month? I was inaugurated for my second term on January 10th. The elliptical hall was full, but the diplomatic chairs of Europe and the United States were empty. Their silence was a war cry. They didn't recognize me anymore. To them, I was a usurper occupying a chair that didn't belong to me. And then, on January 23rd, the farce reached its climax. A boy. A deputy from Vargas, skinny with no executive experience, without having commanded even a condo board, climbed onto a stage in a plaza in Chacao. He raised his right hand and before a crowd and CNN cameras said, "I swear to assume the powers of the national executive as interim president, Juan Guaidó." I watched that on television at Miraflores. First, I felt like laughing. Who is this kid? I asked Celia. Does he think the presidency is a job you win by shouting? But the laughter died in my throat minutes later. The red phone rang. It wasn't a call. It was the news that Donald Trump, the most powerful man in the world, had recognized the kid on Twitter. Then came Brazil, Colombia, France, the UK, more than 50 countries. In a matter of hours, they created a parallel reality. The world said, he was the president. But who slept in Miraflores was me. Who commanded the tanks was me. Who signed the public employees' checks was me. Guaido was a PowerPoint president, a hologram projected by the US State Department, but a dangerous hologram. They froze everything. They took Citgo, our refinery in the US. The Bank of England withheld 31 tons of our gold. Billions of dollars belonging to the Venezuelan people were handed over to this interim government gang. They left us without money to buy insulin, to buy parts for thermoelectric plants. It was daylight robbery, applauded by the Democrats of the world. February 2019 was the month of the invasion. They set up a show on the border with Colombia, in Cúcuta, a concert, Venezuela Live Aid, Richard Branson, that eccentric billionaire, Latin singers, everyone there singing for freedom. It was the perfect cover. Behind the stage, trucks loaded with supposed humanitarian aid waited to cross the border. They said it was food and medicine. I knew it was a Trojan horse. If those trucks crossed the bridge, military invasion would follow behind. They wanted to buy the loyalty of my soldiers on the border. Not one step back, I ordered Pedrino Lopez. Block the bridges, weld the containers shut if necessary. No one crosses without my authorization. On February 23rd, it was the Battle of the Bridges. Tear gas, rocks, Molotov cocktails. They tried to burn the trucks to blame me. But the truth always comes out. It was the opposition vandals themselves who set fire to the cargo. My soldiers, hungry and tired, stood firm. They didn't desert en masse as the CIA promised. That night, Guaidó stood on the Colombian side, looking at Venezuela, realizing that Twitter doesn't topple governments, but the enemy doesn't sleep. In March, they turned off the lights. Nota: há uma quebra no texto original aqui. Inferi a continuação lógica com base no contexto histórico dos apagões e das sanções para manter a fluidez. Invisible to Washington's radars. Gold for food, oil for cash. Planes landing in the dead of night with suitcases of euros and dollars. I became a state smuggler to keep my country breathing. And then, in 2020, the world stopped. COVID-19. For many leaders, it was a disaster. For me, I'll be brutally honest, it was a tool. The pandemic allowed me to decree radical quarantine, the 7+7 scheme. 7 days closed, 7 days open. That emptied the streets. The protests ended because no one wanted to die from a virus. The opposition stayed locked at home holding Zoom meetings while I controlled the state. The pandemic cooled down politics, and while the world fought for masks, a group of mercenaries tried one last ridiculous card. Operation Gideon, May 2020. A private security firm from Florida, Silvercorp, hired by people linked to Guaidó, tried to invade Venezuela by sea in speedboats leaving from Colombia. They thought they were Rambo. They imagined they would reach La Guaira, march to Miraflores, and I would surrender. They were met by fishermen, Bolivarian fishermen, and by our militia. We captured 2 Americans, former Green Berets, Luke Denman and Aaron Berry. I showed them on TV like trophies. Look, I said, imperialism sends its dogs of war, and we capture them with fishing nets. That was the moral end of Guaidó. He signed a contract to kill, to invade, and failed miserably. The opposition disintegrated into mutual accusations. The interim government began to melt like ice on the hot asphalt of Maracaibo. In December 2020, I reclaimed the National Assembly. We held legislative elections. The opposition boycotted again. Their problem. I won. Jorge Rodriguez took over the parliament. The circle closed. I had the executive, the judiciary, the military, and now the legislative. Guaidó was left with no office, no power, just the stubborn support of foreigners who didn't know how to get out of the hole they dug. I survived Trump. He left the White House defeated, and I remained in Miraflores. I survived the sanctions. I survived the drones. I survived betrayal. In 2021 and 2022, the economy started to show signs of life. Timid signs. It's true. The Venezuelan Renaissance, as I called it. Concerts started happening again in Caracas. Luxury restaurants opened in Las Mercedes. A Ferrari was seen on the streets. Did Venezuela fix itself? No. But Maduro's Venezuela stabilized. I felt untouchable. I started traveling again. I went to Egypt, to China. I was received by Lula in Brazil with state honors in 2023. The pariah was back on stage. I thought I had won the game. I thought the worst had passed. But arrogance is a ruler's worst enemy. I underestimated a woman who had no weapons, no armies, but had a word that cut deeper than a sword. Hasta el final. Maria Corina Machado. It was her and the 2024 election that triggered the final sequence of events that brought me to these handcuffs. I thought I could control one more election. The old CNE magic I thought would work one more time. I was wrong. The world had changed, and this time, the trap I set snapped shut on my own leg. Oh, the mistake. Every powerful man commits a fatal mistake. Napoleon invaded Russia in the winter. Hitler opened 2 battlefronts. Me? I signed the Barbados Agreement. I believed my own propaganda. I believed the economy was improving, that the people were resigned, that the PSUV machine was invincible. I accepted free elections in exchange for lifting sanctions. I thought I could neutralize any opponent, as I always did. I took Maria Corina out of the way. She won't run, I said, and she didn't. But I underestimated hatred. Hatred is a fuel more potent than gasoline. When she supported that retired diplomat, Edmundo Gonzalez, a man no one knew, she didn't transfer votes. She transferred fury, the fury of an entire nation. July 28, 2024, my political birthday and my funeral. From early on, I smelled defeat in the air. My red points, the party control tents, were empty. The lines at polling stations were endless, but there was no joy, there was no revolutionary music. There was silence. the silence of those about to execute revenge. At 6 in the evening, the report started arriving at the war room in Miraflores. "President, the numbers don't add up," said Jorge Rodriguez, pale. "We are losing in Petare. We are losing in 23 de Enero. We are losing in the barracks." Losing? No, it was a massacre. 70-30. The entire country had voted to kick me out. Panic set in. Some ministers suggested recognizing the defeat and negotiating an amnesty. I looked at them with contempt. Negotiate? They will hunt us down. They will put us in cages. There will be no surrender. Elvis, stop the count. I called Elvis Amoroso, president of the National Electoral Council. Cut the transmission. Say the system was hacked. Give me the numbers we need. In the early hours of the morning, we announced victory. 51.2%. No tallies, no details, no shame. I went up to the stage to celebrate. I danced salsa. I laughed. I hugged Cilia, but inside I knew I had just declared war on reality. What I didn't expect was a digital trap. The opposition was smarter. They collected the tallies. They digitized everything. Within 24 hours, they put a website online. Any citizen could see their own vote. The proof of the fraud was there. Mathematical, irrefutable, wide open for the whole world to see. The world turned its back on me. Boric in Chile spoke of fraud. Even Lula and Petro, my former allies, asked for the tallies. I was naked in the public square. What followed were months of terror. I launched Operation Tuntun. We arrested thousands, teenagers, adults, anyone who had a protest video on their phone. I blocked X, formerly Twitter. I blocked Signal. I turned Venezuela into a tropical North Korea. I was no longer governing. I was occupying my own country. But the money ran out. The sanctions returned with full force. And worse, loyalty started getting too expensive. The fall didn't come with an invasion of American Marines on the beaches of La Guaira. The empire learned. They don't use bayonets anymore. They use bribes, a reward. $15 million for my head. It looked like just a wanted poster from the Old West. But it was an invitation to betrayal. It was on a Tuesday night. I was preparing to flee. The plan was to go to Turkey, or maybe Iran. The presidential plane was on the runway at La Orchila, fueled up. My most loyal generals, or so I thought, were with me. I boarded the plane. I felt the thud as the doors closed. Goodbye, ingrates, I thought. Keep your ruins. But the plane didn't turn east toward the Atlantic. It turned north. What is happening? I shouted to the pilot over the intercom. The route is wrong. Silence. I looked at my security chief. He had a pistol in his hand, but he wasn't pointing it at the door. He was pointing it at me. "Forgive me, President," he said, eyes downcast. "But my family needs a future. They guaranteed amnesty. Betrayed. Sold like cattle." When the lights of Miami appeared on the horizon, I didn't feel anger. I felt an immense emptiness. The bus driver had reached the final stop. The landing at Homestead Air Reserve Base was cinematic. DEA agents, lights, helicopters. I descended the stairs, not as a head of state, but as a hunting trophy. The cold handcuffs on my wrists were the only real human contact I'd had in years. And now here we are. Southern District of New York Courthouse. Look at me now. The orange uniform has replaced the Italian suits. I no longer have the mustache. They ordered it shaved for hygiene issues. I am just Nicolás Maduro Moros, number 8945. The prosecutor talks about narco-terrorism. He talks about the Cartel de los Soles. He shows charts, bank accounts, testimonies from old friends who are now competing to see who can hand me over faster to reduce their own sentences. They are going to convict me. I know that. This court is not about justice, it is about historical revenge. They want to punish the audacity of a driver who dared to say no to Uncle Sam. But let me say one last thing before they lock me in a concrete cell in Colorado for the rest of my days. I was a product of my time. I was the reflection of a broken, unequal, and resentful Latin America. You can lock me up, you can throw away the key. But as long as there is a hungry child in a slum and a billionaire dining in a skyscraper, there will be another Chavez. There will be another Maduro. History is a pendulum. Today, it swings into my face. Tomorrow, it swings back. I don't regret the power. I regret trusting men who have a price and not values. My name is Nicolás Maduro, and I was the president of the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela, and that neither this judge's sentence nor eternity can ever erase. You heard my defense. You heard how I went from the steering wheel of a bus in Caracas to the absolute command of a nation, and now to this cold defendant's bench in the north. My life was ideology. It was power. It was resistance. And yes, it was tragedy. Now I ask you who watched me this far. Was this story worth your time? If you had the courage to listen to my side of the truth, leave a like on this video. Show the algorithm that history is not made only by the winners. This helps this channel continue revealing what the traditional media hides. And if you think my journey was intense, wait until you hear that of my great ally in Moscow. Subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell right now. You won't want to miss the next dossier. The secret life of Vladimir Putin, from KGB spy to modern czar. Believe me, his game is even heavier than mine. Before you go, I want to read your verdict. Write in the comments, do you think these handcuffs are really my end, or do you believe history still holds a surprise for Nicolás Maduro? Thank you for listening. History never ends, it just changes narrators. Until next time.